What's happening in Iran right now is not just another protest wave. It's a collision between an economic collapse, a legitimacy crisis, and a state security machine that has repeatedly chosen force over reform. The immediate trigger for the latest nationwide unrest was the freefall of Iran's currency and a cost-of-living shock that pushed anger from private conversations into the streets. Multiple credible reports placed the start of this protest wave around December 28, 2025, with demonstrations spreading as prices surged and the rial hit record lows. From there, the message quickly moved beyond "the economy is unbearable" to "the system is the problem." That's the moment when the Islamic Republic's leadership typically shifts from governance mode to survival mode. The crackdown has been severe. The hard part is pinning down the exact number of deaths because the government restricts information, disrupts internet access, and pressures families and medical systems. Human rights monitors and journalists rely on verification networks, documentation, and contacts inside the country, while Tehran disputes many of those figures. For example, the human rights activists' news agency has reported at least 6,059 deaths and tens of thousands of arrests, while Iranian authorities have publicly cited a lower figure around 3,117 deaths. Beyond those figures, there are also much higher claims circulating. A Guardian investigation describes allegations that the true death toll could be far higher than publicly confirmed counts, and explains why verifying numbers is difficult under blackout conditions. Because these higher estimates are not universally verified across independent auditors, the responsible way to present them is as contested claims possible, but not confirmed at the same evidentiary level as the lower, documented, verified tallies. What is clearer than the exact number is the pattern. Security forces using lethal violence, mass arrests, intimidation, and information controls to break momentum and reduce visibility. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have described a heavily militarized clampdown, including actions aimed at suppressing documentation and silencing families. International institutions have also reacted. In late January 2026, the UN Human Rights Council adopted a resolution extending the mandates that monitor Iran and calling for urgent investigation into violations linked to protests that began December 28, 2025. So why does this keep happening in Iran? Because the Islamic Republic is built on a security bargain. The state promises stability and ideological continuity, and in return, it demands political obedience. When economic conditions collapse and that bargain fails, the system tends to respond not with opening, but with coercion, especially through the Revolutionary Guard and affiliated forces. That response can restore short-term control, but it usually deepens long-term resentment. Now, here are the outcomes that matter, the realistic paths from this point, and what could push Iran toward each one. Outcome 1, intensified repression, stability through fear. This is the default trajectory in many authoritarian systems. Arrests expand, surveillance tightens, and the government tries to exhaust the movement rather than negotiate with it. In the short run, it can work, especially if the state keeps the security forces loyal and paid. The downside is that it destroys trust and makes future explosions more likely. It also increases the chance of radicalization, not because people suddenly become extreme by nature, but because they stop believing peaceful change is possible. Outcome 2, a controlled political reset without real democratization. Iran's leadership could attempt tactical concessions, reshuffling officials, adjusting subsidies, relaxing certain enforcement priorities, or offering limited amnesties, just enough to reduce pressure without surrendering power. This can split the public mood. Some people accept the relief, others see it as a trap. The regime prefers this outcome because it buys time while preserving the system. Outcome 3, elite fractures inside the state. If economic pain becomes unmanageable and legitimacy collapses further, the biggest risk for the Islamic Republic is not only the street, it's division among elites, rival networks, commanders, clerical figures, and power brokers blaming each other for the crisis. Reuters reporting in mid-January 2026 framed the system as under severe strain, but still holding together, meaning it hasn't hit a definitive break moment yet. Elite fracture is hard to predict because Iran's internal politics are opaque, but it is one of the few mechanisms that can change the trajectory quickly. Outcome 4, external escalation to shift the narrative. When regimes feel cornered, they sometimes lean into external confrontation, real or rhetorical, to rally nationalist sentiment and frame dissent as foreign-driven. Iran also operates within a regional network of allies and proxies, so escalation can happen indirectly. At the same time, escalation is risky. It can trigger stronger sanctions, military strikes, or miscalculations that damage the economy even more. Outcome 5. Negotiated de-escalation linked to nuclear diplomacy. Iran's internal crisis is happening alongside major tensions around its nuclear program and international inspections. Reuters has reported on the IAEA's concerns about verification and access, and on the scale of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile as assessed by the agency. Issues that can drive international pressure and sanctions decisions. If Tehran believes sanctions pressure plus domestic unrest threatens regime survival, it might consider limited cooperation to reduce external pressure. But the opposite is also possible. It could restrict cooperation further, betting that confrontation consolidates internal control. Now let's talk about what affects Iran's current status the most. What decides whether protests fade, explode, or transform? First, the economy. Inflation, currency stability, and basic affordability. Reports describe inflation remaining extremely high and the rial losing major value through 2025, fueling anger among ordinary people and merchants. If the currency stabilizes and the state can cushion prices, protest energy can drop. If the rial keeps collapsing, the movement can keep renewing itself. Second, security force cohesion. If the guard and security services remain unified and confident, repression is brutally effective. If morale cracks, if pay becomes unreliable, or if commanders fear being scapegoated, the system becomes vulnerable. Iran's leadership understands this and prioritizes loyalty. Third, information control. In modern movements, visibility matters. If the state successfully restricts communications and intimidates documentation networks, it becomes harder for protests to coordinate and harder for the world to measure what's happening. Multiple human rights groups describe blackouts and obstruction as central to the state's approach. Fourth, the diaspora and international pressure. Outside attention can protect activists in some cases by raising the costs of violence, but it can also be used by the regime as propaganda. Foreign interference. The balance depends on what governments do and how credible and targeted their actions are. So, what does this mean for Canada and other partners? For Russia and China, their approach is usually different. Emphasize sovereignty and non-interference, keep strategic ties, and treat unrest as an internal matter. That can provide Tehran with diplomatic cover, but it doesn't solve the economic problem, especially when sanctions, banking restrictions, and investment risk choke growth. For the broader Middle East, Iran's internal instability is a regional variable. If Tehran feels weaker at home, it may either pull back to consolidate internally or lean harder on regional influence to project strength. Either move affects oil markets, shipping risk, and the calculations of neighboring states. Here's the core message your audience should leave with. The Islamic Republic can survive a long time with coercion, but the cost is a society that stops believing in reform, an economy that struggles to breathe, and a state that increasingly relies on fear rather than consent. The death toll numbers are contested because of blackouts and intimidation, but credible human rights reporting and major outlets agree on the fundamentals: widespread lethal repression, mass arrests, and a shrinking space for dissent. What happens next depends on whether Iran's leadership chooses a path that reduces pressure, economic relief and controlled openings, or doubles down on force and accepts long-term instability as the price of staying in power.